All right, well, I wanted to move on to a different topic here, which has a bit more resonance in Australia, and that's the question of whether you both think that Trump-style policies can actually take hold in Australia. I'm thinking in particular of policies like the Muslim ban, especially because Pauline Hanson's One Nation is campaigning effectively on implementing something similar here. So, Stephen, what do you think in terms of whether or not the institutions in Australia can withstand that sort of a ban, and how is it different to the US?
Well, I think a few things about it. First of all, I'm one of those very many people, although I'm a quite avid fan of American politics. Never in a million years did I predict that Trump would win the election. And sitting there on election day and watching the count come in, it wasn't until well after midnight in the United States that I thought, actually, this guy's got a chance. So my sense of it was completely wrong. And the lesson that I take from that and from the previous Brexit campaign is that it could happen here. And one of the reasons why it could happen, I think, is that the politics of the West in the last quarter century has been this neoliberal approach, deregulation, increased competition, and the result of that has been a lot of people have become very, very wealthy, including a lot of poor people, but a lot of people have been left behind. And so there is here, as there is in the United States, a large number of people who are disaffected for the reasons that Tad talked about before, actually, are very disaffected with politics. And they think that the politics hasn't worked for them, although it's worked for a lot of other people who they see have become very rich out of it. So I don't think we can rule out the possibility that it could happen here. And I accept, of course, that the difference between rich and poor is not as stark here as it is in the United States, and that we have a better social safety net here than the United States, but I think it would be very foolish to rule it out. The next bit of the question is, do our institutions have the capacity to check the extremes of Donald Trump? And that's where I worry. Australia is one of the few countries in the West that does not have a Bill of Rights. The United States has a very strong Bill of Rights and has a Supreme Court that has a history of upholding the Bill of Rights and scrutinising and calling administrations into account. And we had a very good illustration of that just last week when the Court of Appeals, as well as the District Court, then followed by the Court of Appeals, said, no, the Muslim ban contravenes the due process provisions of the US Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, I think. Now, we don't have those protections in our Constitution. Actually, the one protection that we do have in our Constitution is a protection against coercion in relation to religion, in Section 116 of our Constitution. But actually, the US court in the United States said, we actually don't have enough evidence to say whether or not the Muslim ban is actually a Muslim ban or whether it's just a ban in relation to those 7 countries. So they made no ruling about that. So presumably the Australian court could make no ruling about that if the same legislation or regulation was passed here. But the problem is that as to the rest of it, we don't have the checks and balances that are provided by the US Bill of Rights. And we've seen that in a lot of things that have happened in Australia. And so, for example, the level of intrusion in some of the Australian anti-terrorism legislation is kind of unique in the world. And the courts will not intervene. The courts have upheld a number of those kinds of provisions. And the anti-bikie laws, which have been they've been knocked down a couple of times, but the third time they got them right. And they're very intrusive in a way that I think would not be permitted in the United States. So personally, I think that the possibility of a Pauline Hanson-style government is something to be scared of.
Yeah. And what do you think, Tad? Do you agree?
I agree in terms of the lack of institutional checks and balances. I think of one really scary thing is that we have a race power in the Constitution which specifically allows racist legislation and has been tested in court in the Howard years as allowing either negative or positive race-based legislation. So, I mean, it's easy enough to do some kind of Arab policy under the current Constitution. It's actually, we have a kind of a scary Constitution that's more about the powers of government than about the rights of people. So I think if those institutional checks and balances aren't there, I think the other thing that is there currently is a political crisis, that there's been a breakdown of popular attachment to the political parties, the old institutions, whether they be civic associations or trade unions that underpinned those parties having a stable base is gone. And so we see this, but in Australia we see this kind of strange situation where there isn't an obvious Trump option. So Cory Bernardi leaves the Liberal Party thinking, I'm riding the Trump wave, but actually he's the opposite of Trump. He is a hard ideologue with a lot of the policies that people hate politicians for.
In favour of free markets.
So I don't know quite how he interpreted that, but lots of people are reading into Trump what they want to read, I guess. And I think it's unlikely that even that a fringe party like One Nation would actually get very far. I think it's more likely there'll be some other kind of reconfiguration with something that looks a bit more moderate but ends up doing some extreme things. And I think the reason the politicians do the extreme things is it makes up for their lack of authority that they used to have, because they used to have a mass base.
I mean, it's a good point, Tad, because we saw just last week in Parliament members of the front bench and the Liberal Party handing around lumps of coal. So everybody is talking about the Liberal Party moving further to the right and being trapped by its right wing. But can I bring in a positive thing?
Yes. Don't shock me, but yes, do, please.
I actually think there's been some real benefits to the advent of the Trump administration. We had, the day after the inauguration, we had millions of people, mainly women, but not only women, millions of people, and you were one of them, I believe.
I was.
Marching on the street in protest at the policies of the Trump administration. We had, on the day of the Muslim ban, on that weekend of the Muslim ban, the American Civil Liberties Union raised $24 million in one weekend, and in that weekend had 3,000 lawyers volunteering and showing up at airports to help gather evidence to overturn the ban. We are seeing the beginning of, I think, the resurgence of progressive politics because people have been complacent during the last 25 years of neoliberalism.
Well, that's probably a good time for us to move on to our final topic for tonight.